Edward Hardy, welcome to Podcast Radio. How are you?
Very well, thank you. Thank you for having me.
You've got a fabulous podcast, The Hardy Report, very popular too. Just tell me about the podcast, because although you're a Brit, a lot of this is based on American politics.
It is indeed. I really got into American politics sort of in the run-up to I've been interested in politics since before the 2010 general election, but I got interested in US politics really and focused on that in the run-up to the 2016 election in early 2015. And that just it's a fascinating process, how it all works. There's so much to cover and talk about. And so I set up the podcast because I was tweeting and I was doing commentary on it. And I thought, why not interview these fascinating characters, from candidates to people who are in positions of power at the time, officials, people who are reporting on it. So we've had senior White House correspondents give their take. And it's been a fascinating ride, really. And when I started it, I thought all of this commentary, I thought, oh, this will only be a brief period. We'll have Hillary Clinton and so on, like everyone else did. And then it was a wild 4 years. And I thought, I'll launch the podcast, get to talk to the people on the ground and really understand what's going on. So that's really the basis for it. But it's been a fascinating few years. I think everyone can agree.
Yeah, I know what it's like coming to American politics and trying to work out how it all works. I learned the most about American politics and how it works by watching The West Wing.
I've watched that several times.
Yeah. So that shows you how backward I am compared to your in-depth knowledge of it. So where did you grow up then?
Well, so I grew up in the north of England, and I went to school down in the south of England. Hence, how I lost my accent. Sort of probably people in the north consider that a bit of a betrayal, probably the way that I speak now. But I went to school down south, and I've sort of grown up around the London area and around that Westminster side, which is where I got my UK political interest from, because I've been around that environment for such a long time. And I mean, the UK side has been incredibly fascinating in the last few years, and we had some great guests on the podcast actually talk about UK politics. We had then Secretary of State for Scotland, David Mundell, actually on the day that Theresa May announced she was stepping down as Prime Minister, and that was a really lucky coincidence, but fantastic interview that we got out of it. And it really shaped my passion for politics, being so fortunate to be around Westminster from such a young age, really. And as I say, it helped really get these fantastic guests, which they're the people that make the podcast what it is. I have to always say, it's, I might host it and do the questions, but really it comes down to those fantastic guests we've managed to get on.
Yeah, but you hold your own with them. Your knowledge and your research that you do, you've got some guests who have got some pretty deep thoughts and some pretty deep understanding of the system, and you definitely hold your own with them. As a Brit, do you find that surprises a lot of the American guests?
I think it does. The accent seems to help with Americans. They seem to sort of find it quite disarming when you have a British accent. I don't know what it is about our accent, but Americans seem to love it. But yeah, it's sometimes having to challenge people who are really quite senior in these roles. I'm a 25-year-old. I'm relatively young, and interviewing, say, a White House correspondent who's been doing their job for several decades. And you have to ask them these questions that you want to get the interesting responses that haven't just been said time and time again. And that's really the challenge about it, is you have to do so much research into these individuals, their career, what they might have said. And I think sometimes it does surprise them when we'll be having the interview and I'll go, and this thing that you mentioned several years ago, that you talked about how to cover a president, for example, or someone on the campaign trail, you say, actually, you said this, and this is an interesting approach to take. I mean, for example, one of my latest interviews was with Tom Steyer, who ran for president in 2020, but he's been involved in the Democratic Party as a sort of activist and donor for quite a long time. And we were talking about climate change, which in itself, fascinating topic, something that really needs to be addressed. But we went into his role as in the whole sort of process as a billionaire, about how it could be funded. People talk about how that links to a wealth tax, something he supported, but he's also in the category that would be affected by it. And we had a really interesting discussion on something that most people would ask him simply just about climate change, but we ended up going into his personal connection to it. And it's those sort of approaches that I think make the show an interesting listen for people, because you get to hear the points and the questions and the answers that you wouldn't just get from sort of a 5-minute snippet on BBC News.
I get the feeling, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, from listening to your podcast, that your personal political leanings from an American perspective would lean towards the left. And is that true?
I think for a lot of young people, what we believe and the worlds that we envision and support often ends up on that left side of politics. So believing you have to tackle issues like climate change with radical approaches, supporting increases to the minimum wage, addressing like housing issues, for example, I'm really passionate about. And we had a really fascinating individual who'd written a book about how to address the housing crisis that exists. And topics like that, I think, often end up on the left side of politics. It's never my intention with the show, it wasn't when I started it, to be one side or another.
So the podcast itself doesn't have a political agenda?
No, we have people like Tim Miller, who was Jeb Bush's press secretary during the 2016 campaign, right near the beginning of the show. And I've always been open to having Republicans on the show. Often it finds it's quite difficult to get them to come on the show. That was always a challenge. And there have been people that I've wanted to get on the show, I won't name names, that, to be fair, on both sides of the aisle, that didn't come on. But I always want to have those conversations with people, because I think that we often live in a world that's a bubble. Social media really created that problem for us. And while I might not agree with someone, while I might have my own personal feelings, like every interviewer does, and that might shape how I approach it, the listeners want to hear from everyone. They want those people to be exploring those topics and know why people think the way they do. And so it was never the intention of the podcast to be one way or another. And I really try to avoid that being the case, because I think that these topics are topics that affect people. Certainly the generations that are to come are going to be affected by them. And I just wanted to talk about them, really. But yes, I think that it's hard not to acknowledge that my youth and my personal views are going to impact the sort of focus we go for.
I actually think for a lot of British people, it is hard for us to understand the right of politics in the US. I think, we have a different left and right in the UK to the US. And I think for a lot of British people, it's hard to understand how popular it is and how important it is. And I think in the same way, a lot of Americans who are politically to the right of their system have a hard time believing or understanding I'll give you the example. As a radio presenter, I go to lots of radio conventions in the US, obviously not recently, but the last talk show one I went to in New York was done by Talkers, which is Michael Harrison, who's actually a liberal. But he runs talkers.com, which is a website. He calls it the Bible of the talk radio industry. So I went to this convention, and of course I was the only Brit there, as I usually am at these things. And the first guy I met, I'm not going to say his name, but my job at the convention was to introduce this guy on stage. And this was a guy who'd worked for Donald Trump in one of his casinos in Atlantic City. And he's now a talk show host on the radio. And the first thing he said to me was, Obama was the president at the time. He says, "Can I just apologize for our current president?" And at the time, I was like, I could understand somebody saying that during a Trump presidency. But I think, there's something about the British that just don't understand the the reason why people are so far right the way they. I went to another convention, which was a breakfast. No, it was a learning convention in Minneapolis, and on the front page of the brochure for the convention, it said you must not take firearms into the sessions. Now, my first view was, well, tough room. If you don't go down too well, they'll shoot you. But the second was, they're not going to put that warning on the front page of the brochure if it's not a problem. And I remember mentioning it to one of the Americans who was in the audience with me and saying, wow, and they said, yeah, they're not going to take our guns off us. And this thing of God and guns and this thing did you get a better, I still don't fully understand it. Did you get a better feeling or a better understanding of why so many people, because Trump didn't lose by that much, why so many people lean that far to the right of their political system, something that I think a lot of British people don't understand. Did you get more of a feeling why they've gone that way through speaking to people from that side of American politics?
I think that's a really interesting point, actually, because for British people, the left and the right over in the UK would almost certainly be all encompassed by the Democratic Party.
Yeah.
There really isn't a Republican side of politics over in the UK. Nothing really equivalent. The closest we ever probably got to it was UKIP. And even they were probably on the moderate side of some of these Republicans. So it really has been interesting getting an insight from the Republicans that I've managed to speak to, and also some experts that have looked into this. So I think really social media is such an integral part of how America has become so divided between the left and the right. One of the people that I spoke to was Tristan Harris, who used to work for Google. He's one of the main featured experts in the Netflix show, The Social Dilemma. And he talks about how social media has been built to divide people. And in a country as vast as America is, politicians, particularly ones on a state or national level, have to use social media in the digital world in order to communicate. That's just the way it has to be, particularly at the presidential level. And so what I'm served up on Twitter will be different to what you're served up on Twitter, will be different to what every single listener to this interview is served up on Twitter. And when you amplify that 300 million plus times, everyone is fed the worlds that they are essentially given and want to be given, and it burrows them deeper and deeper into their entrenched views. And that interview, I think, really gave me that insight. I think that explains better than anything a politician can say as to how America has become that way. Because if you look at Donald Trump, he got elected because of his Facebook strategy in a way. In 2016, his Facebook strategy was far and above anything that the Democrats managed to put out. And that's got to so many people and reached out to so many people. You still have a situation where so many individuals out there believe that the 2020 election was stolen, because all they see is Donald Trump clips or people on that wing of the party sharing that online and talking about it and posting in groups. And that's, in a way, something that needs to be talked about now. He might be out of office, the world might be a different place, but if we don't fundamentally address social media, such a powerful tool, it's going to constantly divide people. I mean, you look at the Brexit referendum, for example, social media played such an integral part over here in the UK. It's something that's universal, the impact of social media, but I think that is truly what has created such a divided America.
Fox News probably helped as well at the beginning, I would have thought.
Oh, certainly. The media platform, America, again, it's so different to what we have over in the UK. The UK's media is pretty much, okay, it has opinions here and there and that.
Pretty liberal, though, isn't it?
Yeah, it's pretty, because it has to be, in a way. To be on air over here, to follow those Ofcom guidelines, to stick to whatever the watchdog for the industry or the outlet is, they have to follow a fairly reasonable approach where they're giving both sides of an argument, giving the expert opinions.
Now, the people on the right of politics would argue that we have a liberal bias media here.
But, well, they might.
Apart from newspapers. Newspapers seem to have, the Daily Mail is not like the Daily Mirror. Yeah.
But I think when you look at, say, what happens in America, if you look at their opinionated shows, they are far and away different to what we have. Ours is really the reason people think it's liberal is, and this is going to sound fairly controversial, but the idea that something is, quote unquote liberal is simply just that it's straight down the middle these days. It's not opinionated one way or the other. You look at the BBC, people claim the BBC is this left-wing outlet or something. It really isn't. If you watch most BBC content, it's very straight down the middle. Whereas in America, they don't have to adhere to those same rules. So Fox News could put climate change deniers on from morning till evening, and no one would really stop them. The Fox News morning show used to put Donald Trump on during the 2016 campaign, and he would just talk to the Fox News audience and say whatever he wanted to say unchallenged for, an hour plus.
Yeah, and the media there, when I see interviews with Trump, even from the likes of CNN and more liberal networks, I don't think they did a good enough job of challenging some of the BS that Trump was coming out with the whole term of his presidency. Did you get that feeling too?
Definitely. The two people I spoke to their credit, the two White House reporters that I had on the show, they're individuals who have been quite good at holding the Trump administration to account. When I spoke to them, it was during the Trump administration. Brian Karem, for example, the senior White House reporter for Playboy, he has been one of the strongest individuals for not taking nonsense from the Trump administration. He sat there and he would challenge them. And for example, there was a clip where he asked Donald Trump, would he accept the result of the election? And at the time, everyone said, this is a ridiculous concept. Of course he will. Why are you asking this? And then, of course, he didn't. And it's sort of that journalism, not being afraid of the backlash you're going to get because someone needs to ask that question, is something that a lot of reporters do, to their credit, but there are a lot that don't. And there are a lot of outlets where often they will have people on and they won't ask the tough enough questions. There's one news outlet that I won't say by name, but when I give this example, it's not going to be difficult to work out. One of the hosts regularly interviews their a politician who's their brother. And the interviews are, they do not address what needs to be addressed. They're quite lighthearted. They ask a few tough questions, but then they make jokes about, there was one instance where they said, I only had you on because mum told me I had to. That's not what a news outlet should be doing.
Yeah.
Let alone allowing two brothers to be talking to each other on air. You should have had a different reporter asking those questions. So I think that's part of the problem.
Yeah.
Is often it's about American news. If you watch it, it's about 5 minutes of news conversation and then it's ads. It's an entertainment industry, a lot of their news outlets, and that's where the problem falls.
Yeah, and it's all about ratings, and they do a really good job, though. Every time they go to a commercial, they say, coming up later and coming up next. In every they're hooking you all the time. They do a really good job at that. But, yeah, I wonder, Michael Harrison makes this point. I'm from Talkers.com, and I might be getting the phrasing wrong here, but he seems to think that a lot of people in politics in America, in any debate on any subject, they seek victory over truth. And it's become just like because it's become like a sporting team. I'm a Liverpool fan, and when you think, and I will, we're going through a really bad patch at the moment, but I'll defend Jurgen Klopp to the hill, but it's because they're my team. And I wonder if that's part of the problem as well. People just support their team no matter how crazy or how inappropriate their leaders and representatives are behaving.
Almost certainly that's an issue that exists in America, because you look at conversations that have gone on in recent weeks where you talk about holding Donald Trump accountable for what went on January 6th and the attack on the US Capitol that occurred. And to what extent you hold him accountable, that can be debated. But there is part of his actions that led to that. Whether it was the fact that the rally simply took place that day, which was at his encouragement, or whether it was the words that he said or the actions and behavior that he did for months. But instead of accepting that this was problematic behavior by president and it was against his
and less than presidential.
Exactly. Well, but this is the thing. People wanted to talk about this is Republican or Democrat issue. It instantly became a Republican or Democrat issue. You talk about the gun situation earlier.
Yeah.
It's a Republican or Democrat issue.
Yeah.
Instead of people now looking at things, and I think President Biden's really trying to change that. He talks about how it's an American issue, and I think that's what people need to start framing things.
What is he saying? The guns is an American issue?
Well, no. When he talks about, for example, COVID relief,
right,
he describes it as an American issue that needs to be addressed. When it's climate change, he describes it as this is an issue for America and the world, instead of describing it as this is something our party is going to address.
Right.
And that is a really important framing change.
Yeah.
That people in America need to do, because too often things have become, this is something our party's going to achieve. This is something our candidate's going to achieve. And it becomes very politicized very quickly. Yeah. And people need to pull back from that if you're actually going to achieve anything, because otherwise, particularly in a political system like America, which was set up to try and avoid one party having complete dominant control, you have to work together. You can't have issues that are politicized when no one from either side wants to work with the other. You have to work together, and it's healthy to work together. Bipartisan government is something that in previous eras before the last president took office, people did regularly, and it worked and it achieved things.
Didn't they even have people from the other side in their own cabinet?
Yeah, well, sometimes they would. You look at, say, back in 2008 when then Senator John McCain was running for president, he genuinely considered having a running mate who was a Democrat. He thought about having a vice president who was a Democrat to say, for 4 years, I and a Democrat will run the country. That was going to be his pitch. And ultimately, he got convinced to do something which potentially was the starting gun on the Republican Party going in the wrong direction. But if he'd gone down that route, which was quite a common view that people could work together, it would have been a different future. And I think that that's what people need to go back to, is politicians like John McCain, who considered bipartisanship, even like Barack Obama, who had to work with the other side of the aisle to get things through Congress. That's something that people need to do. And Joe Biden, famous bipartisan, he did that throughout his career in the Senate. And I think that's part of what helped him get elected, is people like this idea of people working together. And hopefully he'll be able to do that, because one thing I've learned from talking to people on the podcast is that this divided America basically will get nothing done, and the country will just be in a perpetual stalemate. And that's just no one wins there.
Well, I mean, we're live on YouTube right now, so this will be topical right now, but it'll probably be out of date in a couple of weeks' time when you're on the podcast radio show. But the current situation we've got now with the impeachment trial, Biden's not going to really get anything done until this is all sorted out. So there's an example there of it not working out, isn't it?
I think that's why they didn't have witnesses in the end.
They didn't, because they were going to. Yesterday, I caught up with, and they were going to. I think the people who wanted him impeached, the Democrats, they wanted to call a witness, and then the Republicans said, "Well, we're going to call 100 witnesses or something just to slow it down." I mean, it's like filibustering, isn't it? That's
essentially was the Republicans said, "We'll just hold up your entire legislative agenda for the next 2 years until the midterms, when Republicans hope they'll win either the House or the Senate." And be able to impede his agenda anyway. And they basically said, look, we'll just play this out as long as humanly possible, which is why it didn't happen. I mean, that in itself is we could go into all how that's shameful that there's somehow a system where politicians didn't want to discuss the truth and have people who are witnesses. But it's part of, again, I think it plays into what President Biden has taken the approach to do, is he just wants to move on so he can actually start approaching these political issues and trying to find some common ground, because God knows that America's Congress really needs to start trying to establish some common ground instead, sort of leave the trenches and sort of, have a discussion among each other about what they can actually do for their country.
We talked about the different systems, the Westminster system and the system they have in the US. Who has the better system? You understand them both. Who has the better system?
I have to be honest, it's going to sound like I'm being biased about sort of the UK side of things. I think we do. I think there are.
But we don't have democracy, do we? Because we don't have an elected upper house.
Well, I think there are flaws, which is what I was going to say. I think there is problems.
It's a pretty big flaw, is that to not have elected people running the country.
Well, this is the thing. The House of Lords obviously needs to be drastically reformed. I don't actually think that an elected second chamber is necessarily the right way forward. I can be potentially swung one way or the other on this, but I would say that I don't think, given how that often leads to gridlock in America, that's the right way. What I would say is that a second chamber should be, or was established to be, a chamber that would examine, look into the legislation, and make sure basically it was the correct thing based on evidence, worked in the best interest. And I think that's what a second chamber should do. Is it should be there. It should be a chamber full of experts, people who might be scientists or economists or professors or so on, rather than just people who are donors. I don't think that's a smart system. I don't think most people in Britain agree that's a smart system, that it's donors. But I think if it was full of experts, people who actually knew about the laws that were being passed, I think it would be a really useful second chamber. But
we don't have that. I mean, I've lived in 3 different countries with slightly different systems. I lived in New Zealand for 7 years, and they don't even have an upper house. They just don't have one. They have the beehive, which is where decisions are made, and that's it. That's one system. And I also lived in Australia for 6.5 years, and they have an elected upper house. And they had an interesting thing, because they've got a 2-party system, Labour and Liberal, but Liberal are Conservative, which is confusing, but that's how it is. But they have a 3rd party, and I forget what I think they were called the Democrats. I get them mixed up. There was one called the Social Credit, which was, I think that was in New Zealand. I think they were called the Democrats. And they realized they couldn't take the House of Representatives in the election because of the system they have. But they realized they had a good chance of getting the upper house. So they ran a campaign just to take the upper house. And their slogan was, and I'm not making this up, it's very Australian, their slogan was, "We'll keep the bastards honest." I just think that, I mean, Australian politics is fascinating as well. But getting back to my point, you say that you think that the British system is better. Why is the British system better then?
I think the British system is more democratic than
with no elected upper house.
Well, that in itself, I think, can be. if you look at the way that the US system works, it's so partisan and gerrymandered, and the way that they decide their district. And
for anyone who doesn't understand that, it's the way that they change the electoral borders. But we do that here too.
Well, we do, but it has to go through processes and independent panels, and looking at the Conservatives couldn't just show up and go, "We're now going to change all of these parliamentary constituencies to make sure that we always win a majority." Whereas what you end up with in America is there are these absurd districts. I mean, I think one of them is held by a Republican called Dan Crenshaw, and I recommend people go and look up his district. And it's just bizarrely shaped because it's been deliberately gerrymandered to only essentially contain, like, the way it goes up, these Republican voting cities and towns and locations. And having a system like that is so blatantly flawed because, as anyone could have predicted, if you, the governing party, can decide what the voting areas look like, what are you going to do? You're going to skew them in your favor so that you retain power. And that's what they do. So that bit is flawed. Whereas over here, we also have greater control on the way that our parliament and our parties shape up. So even if, for example, you're in a seat like I once lived in one of the staunchest, strongest Labour seats in the country, and there was no way that anyone other than the Labour candidate was going to win that election. You could have literally put a cat in a red bow as their candidate, and it would have won.
This, of course, was pre-Brexit.
Yes, but they could have won that seat pretty solidly without any effort, without any campaigning. And sure enough, we never heard from the candidate,
right?
Because they didn't have to. And so, okay, you have those seats that exist, and there's a slight problem. But when you get involved in the process, you can start to work on how you shape that party. You can potentially go to how that candidate, who that candidate should be. It might be, a Labour or Conservative seat and a Labour or Conservative victory, but you can work on that candidate. You can work on that party leader. You can help to address that. Whereas in America, you end up with your party leader through essentially the same sorts of politically fixed events that happen. You look at Donald Trump, for example. The way that he managed to win that is he basically just took over the Republican Party. No one had a chance at beating him. Whereas over here, you can easily address sort of your party makeup a lot better. And also, we have the power of recall. That's something Americans don't have. We have the power of recall. So if you have a member of parliament who commits an egregious scandal, and I know there are only a few criteria for what can be recalled, but you can recall them as well. So we do have better systems. I'm not saying ours is a perfect system. I don't think ours is a perfect system. I think most democracies can be improved and altered. But I do think we are better than what America's is. Certainly right now, we're better than what America's situation is.
I don't know who's got the perfect system, and obviously I don't know enough about both systems, but, just looking at it, the House of Lords is one that does bother me, and particularly things like hereditary peers. I mean, that makes gerrymandering look like a non-event if you can be born into ruling. But I do like the way that the primaries, or how I understand the primaries work, is that they have to go to each one of these small constituencies. And if you live in America, you do have a chance of meeting the future president. Whereas I don't know, because of the old Etonian thing that we have going here, whether you have a chance before any election of actually, in the run-up to it, of actually meeting the future prime minister.
Although in America you do have the issue when it comes to, say, the primary system. It's often whoever has the most money and the most sort of financial backing that wins in American elections. And also when it comes to the president, they have the electoral college problem that exists, where now the election is less about every state in America and more about a handful of states that the president needs to swing each election. So there are sort of pros and cons of both systems. My view, though, is that a system that can be so easily and quickly gridlocked is just it's inherently flawed. And it might have started out like a great idea. I think there are people that would advocate for elected chambers for both sides, but I think that requires you to have other elements of a strong democracy, of people that genuinely want to work together and are purely putting party above country. They're putting their country first. And I think, unfortunately, America is now in a situation where there is a large chunk of politicians that hold office out there who genuinely are there for their own self-interest and putting their own careers first. You look at some of the Republican senators, for example, the moment Donald Trump lost that election, their thought was not, okay, how can we work for the next 4 years to improve this country? Their thought was, how can I win the presidency in 4 years? And I think that having that sort of system again, it just doesn't work.
Yeah, I think where ours works a lot better is with the budget. Our budget comes through, the Chancellor announces the budget, and that's it. In America, it can really grind to a halt over the budget.
it can take years to get. It can literally be an entire president's
It's a
term.
mess. It's a mess. That is terrible.
Which is absurd. Also, one perk of our system that really goes unacknowledged is how easy it is also for us to replace or remove a prime minister, because if that is a situation where you only need a majority of the House to get rid of the House of Commons, you need a majority of the House of Commons to remove them. Whereas in America, you have this, as we've just seen, an impeachment trial is the only way to remove them, and it's so impossibly hard to remove a president that it's basically it's null and void, the process. There's no point trying there. Once they're elected, unless they commit the most egregious crime, they will never be removed. They might be voted out in 4 years, but they'll never be removed. Whereas over here, if you get a significant scandal with a prime minister, it's quite easy to get enough members of their own party to join with the rest of the House of Commons to remove them. So I think that is a big benefit, that you don't have this centralized power in one figure that's essentially immovable. It really is a parliamentary system that requires the House of Commons to be working as an effective cog in the wider machine. I think that's quite a good element of how our democracy functions.
Assuming Donald Trump doesn't get impeached, and it doesn't look like they're going to actually have the smoking gun to impeach him, and we can say he was unstatesmanlike, he was unpresidential, it was because of him, but unless you can actually say that he directly incited the riot, it does look like he won't be impeached. Assuming he doesn't, is he going to come back as president?
Well, I would say that the biggest problem is I don't think there's any evidence that Democrats could have presented, by the way, that would have gotten impeached.
Right.
To be honest, I genuinely, I don't think that there is enough evidence out there of anything. I mean, they could have literally presented a tape of him saying, I was entirely responsible for what happened there, and Donald Trump acknowledging what he did, going, Donald J. Trump, incited the attack on the US Capitol, and you still wouldn't have got 17 Republicans to vote to impeach. Genuinely don't think you would have. But when it comes to whether a run again, I don't think he will. I genuinely don't think he enjoyed being president. I think that was very clear, is he didn't enjoy being president. What he enjoyed, and what he's made no secret of enjoying, is he likes to be the kingmaker. He liked, when he was on Twitter, for example, to endorse a candidate and help them win. That was what he wanted to do. And so what I suspect he'll do is I suspect he'll try and find some foray into the media, whatever that may be, whether that's setting up his own one or working with an existing media organization. I think he'll try and do that, especially since he doesn't have a Twitter account anymore. And I think that he'll also want to run what they have in America, super PACs, essentially just fund the campaigns of individuals that are running for office. And I think he'll want one of those. And he'll set up, using his donor base, he's got a huge donor base, he'll set up one of those, and he'll try and control the Republican Party, force people to come to Mar-a-Lago and beg for his endorsement and his support. I think that's what he'd love to do, because then he can just stay at Mar-a-Lago, golf all day. No one can truly criticize him or attack him because he can't see any of it. He's just sat at home. And he can live the life that he wanted to. And that, to be honest, that's what he actually apparently wanted to do wanted to win. He was planning to set up Trump TV right up until the election. They were planning to build more Trump towers in countries around the world. He didn't want to win the election. He just wants to be this powerful figure that people talk about or people require to get into office. And that's, I think, where he'll end up. And the Republican Party doesn't want him back either. You've got like Senator Josh Hawley, Senator Ted Cruz, people who want to run for office, former UN Ambassador Nikki Haley. They all want the nomination, so I don't think that they want him back either.
Right. So it's not going to be the end of Trumpism, though, is it? It's no. But him as the president again, you can't see that happening. Okay.
Well, because you can't get rid of Trumpism now. In a way that it exists. It might morph, it might change, it might take a different name over time, but the fundamental basis of what got him elected is now in America's political bloodstream. And you can't really remove it from that. Okay, you might be able to nullify it, you might be able to reduce its influence over time and through a lot of work to tackle the issues that existed there. But I don't think you will ever truly remove what he stood for, in a way, what his agenda, what his approach was, because I think people already take it. You look at the Georgia Congresswoman, who I won't mention by name, but who's been stirring up a lot of controversy with her conspiracy theories and so on that she spread, and really offensive views that most Americans agree was offensive. People like that have sprung up now, and they will fill the void that he wants.
Was she the one that talked about the Jewish space lasers or something?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes. It's just, some of them were just absolutely absurd. I mean, ignoring how deeply anti-Semitic or offensive they might have been, they were just purely bonkers comments that people were used to mock and say, oh, these are the far corners of Facebook where people rant about wearing tinfoil hats, rant about how the earth is flat. And now, sure enough, one of them has made their way into Congress. So, but that's what Trumpism is. In a way, it is people who, adopt that. You look at that, they live in their little bubble. And again, it comes back to the problems that exist in America's political system. Because it was such a staunchly red district, all they needed to do was win 50.1% of the Republican primary vote, and then they were going to win the district. And so I don't even think that there was a Democrat running against her in the end. And this is sort of the problem that exists. And that's why Trumpism can't go away, because there will always be enough seats in America where someone can take that approach and get into office.
Who was that guest you had on the Hardy Report podcast that said that that Trumpism was a winner of this election or something? He put a spin on you. Were trying to say to him something about Biden's won the election or something. And he said, no, I think Trumpism. What was the exact phrasing, and who was he?
Yeah, so that was Joe Walsh, who used to be a Republican congressman, actually. He used to be in Congress as a Republican, and a fairly right-wing Republican at that. And he actually tried to run against Donald Trump in the 2020 primary. Then Donald Trump rigged the primary to basically make sure that loads were cancelled, so no one could ever actually beat him. It was an absurd system. But he came on to talk about essentially the issues that exist with the Republican Party, because I asked him about, do you think now Trump's gone, will you be able to rejoin the Republican Party? Will it return to this conservative political party that you might disagree with, but was part of politics and had a place in politics? And he said, no, Trumpism is now the Republican Party. And he could never rejoin that, even though he was once, on the right of that party. He now doesn't have a home there, because what has happened is this ideology of Trumpism, and there'll be plenty of books written over the next few years. I'm sure I'd be shocked if some don't come out this year.
You may write one.
Well, if I had the time, I'm sure I would. But if a publisher wants to come along, I'll happily write about my experience of covering the whole political system over the last few years. But it's definitely, I think, as depressing as it might be for people listening, it's so hard to stamp out an ideology in America now, because they say how people just retreat to their bubbles. My podcast, I could be critical of the Trumpism wing of the party. They're not listening. They're not listening to my podcast. In the same way as they might think someone who does a podcast in the sort of Trumpism side of things might be equally sort of disappointed that people on the Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez wing of the Democratic Party don't listen to them. Problem is, people are just in their bubbles, and I wish that was something that we could address. I don't think it will be. I think that's something that's going to exist now for a long time, while social media comes back again. I know we keep looping around here, but social media, really, until you address that exist on social media, you can't address the issues that exist in places like America's political system.
So how should they address them? I mean, sounds like you're talking about censorship here, which is another hot button in the US, freedom of speech.
See, I don't think it comes down to censorship at all. I think it comes down to the fact that social media, its whole profit model is based around keeping you on the site as long as possible. How do they do that? They throw up more stuff that you agree with. They throw up stuff that slowly pushes you down the rabbit hole. I mean, if you go on YouTube and you start on a fairly controversial topic, about 5 or 6 videos down, you'll end up in this absolutely weird world of insane conspiracy theories about how, the sort of ones about space lasers starting wildfires and stuff. And it's so easy to do.
Yeah.
And sites are fixing those systems, but what they need to do, they don't have to do this censorship. What they have to do is stop treating sort of the what they serve up so cavalier, in such a cavalier manner. And what they actually have to do is serve up what's actually happening in the world. Different opinions. Challenge what someone's putting out there. And I don't mean, for example, if you're a Democrat, only show Republican content. Mix it up. Show people who are on all the different spectrums out there of a position, rather than just simply one thing.
I don't know if you could regulate for that, though. I really don't know. That would be a tough ask. Because they're not going to self-regulate. Because, as you say, they want you to be on there as long as possible.
Well, this is the problem: is at what extent do you have governments intervene? And I talked to, as I say, it comes back to that interview I did with Tristan Harris, where we talked about how they address these. And really, it has to be an international effort, because otherwise, what will happen is if the UK tries to put restrictions on how Twitter behaves, Twitter will go to Ireland, which I think is actually where a lot of social media companies base headquarters. For example, they'll base them there. If Ireland did something, they'll move somewhere else, and they'll just keep moving because they can. There's nothing that stops them doing that. If you try and regulate what Facebook is doing in America, again, they'll just move to another country that won't regulate them, so that they can operate.
But there are regulated forms of media, obviously not as regulated here. And you mentioned TV, obviously Fox News. They clearly have a leaning, and AM radio in the US, dominated by people like Rush Limbaugh and others who are so far to the right, it's really scary. That's not going to change, even if the social... I think that genie's out the bottle. I don't think you can unring that bell. I think you're stuck with it.
I fear that you're probably right to an extent. I wish you weren't, is the sort of situation. I think we have to try. We can't just give up the fight. And, this is like with misinformation circulating on social media, sites have started to act because people kept fighting and kept fighting and kept fighting. And okay, it's not completely fixed, but we're on the road there. Social media has done a lot of positives, but it's done a lot of damage in the few years that it's been around in our life. And if those companies now put the same level of effort that they did into becoming the global powers that they have become, into fixing the problems, and even going further and trying to fix the divisions that exist within our societies, I think they're able to do that. I think they have such a strong power, and I think these social media companies really could use their force for good. They've got, banks of financial ability that they don't have to worry about losing a little bit of revenue here and there. They're able to actually go out and make this difference. And I think it comes down to them actually really stepping up and saying, we're going to do what we can here to fix the problem that arguably they have caused.
Let's say it went further. Let's say, it had to be regulated even more. We're talking now regulating the internet, which is a scary place. You are a world famous podcaster. You have, you've already, you're on podcast radio. You've already said that, your political leaning from the American point of view is to the left of it's more liberal and progressive, as it would be called there, than the supporter of the GOP. How would you feel if somebody started saying to you, your podcast needs to be a bit more balanced because you're not having enough Republicans on and you're not challenging the Democrats you have on? We're in a dodgy area there, my friend.
This is why I think people don't want to get to a point where regulation has to occur. People don't want to have to be regulating everything that can be said. That, for example, that after the interview, you have to interview someone who's directly the polar opposite of me to make
Well, when I worked for the BBC, that was, I did a breakfast show at BBC Wiltshire, and I went through 2 general elections when I was there, and that was literally what you had to do. If you had somebody from one, you had to give them equal airtime. You had to do that. Yeah.
If the organisation chooses that approach, I think that's perfectly reasonable.
Yeah, it wasn't a regulation. It was the organisation. There was a policy of the BBC.
I think when you get to a point of regulation, I think that's always the last resort. I don't think anyone truly wants to get to a point of regulation with the internet and speech and all of that, because then you get to this world that people fear of, and people talk about of, an authoritarian situation where the government chooses exactly what is allowed to go on air. I think people would be concerned about that, and I don't think you'd be able to get enough support because of that concern. Whether or not it was the right way to go, I just don't think you'd ever be able to get that level of support in politics or in whichever country you're in to actually secure regulation.
Sometimes the regulation can mean you get something. You can end up with a bias because of the regulation. For instance,
you'll also find that someone pops up elsewhere. You have those sites that are now popping up because they think that Twitter's too regulated or too hard and censorship. So you end up where these alternatives will emerge, and it's never going to fully stamp out the problem. What you have to do is you have to work with these companies, and these companies have to work for the better of society. You take Facebook, for example. It was set up to connect us and keep us connected, to build a world where we can all communicate together.
Wasn't it set up, though, for horny university students to rate
I think
other university students for their sex appeal? Wasn't that why it was set up?
I think that's how the social network film portrays how it was set up. I think Mark Zuckerberg might have a different view as to how it was set up or why it was set up. But arguably it was about connectivity and communication. What the motivation behind that was, you can choose for yourself. But if you had a site that was about communication, that's really important. You look at Twitter, it was about ensuring that people could follow the news as and when it was happening, instead of having to wait for the BBC to report what was going on. If there was an incident, or something positive or something negative in an area, you would know instantly because the people around it would be able to share what was going on. That's a really important tool. And almost certainly social media has done some good in being able to expose some terrible atrocities and get the word out about that. And some really brave activists around the world have used it for that good. And if that's what it was doing, that's fantastic. And it can still do that. And the sites want to do that. What they have to do is they have to stamp out when you have deranged conspiracy theories and misinformation. While we can talk about, we could say, well, where's the line on that? I think there are things that we could all agree shouldn't be being publicized. It sounds like an absurd line, but giant space lasers and wildfires shouldn't be being put on social media. Talking about the earth is flat, things we can all agree are wrong, shouldn't be out there.
I think it'd be a shame if they disappeared, because they're good fun to read, those things.
Yeah, but this is the thing, is that...
But doesn't it, don't you have to just, you have to say, well, the people who are reading this stuff, if the people are too silly to understand that this is complete nonsense, isn't that not the social media? It's not their fault that someone's an idiot, I mean, I say this because, I've, been in broadcasting for a while, and certain things I've said, I've had to, people have pulled me up on, and I've gone, well, isn't it obvious I was joking? But, if they're silly, that's not my fault.
The problem you have with that approach is, well, you and I might say, this is obviously absurd, this is obviously hilarious, this is ridiculous. There are people, because of the way that the social media rabbit hole works, who that's all they end up seeing, and they start to believe it, and then they share it with their friends, and then they start to believe it.
That happens, though, with mainstream media. And one of it's probably the biggest criticism I have of all politicians, is that if a public opinion, what people believe, is false. Like, if people believe, like in the Brexit debate is the classic one we had here, there were people who believed the immigrants were stealing all the jobs, and the immigrants were coming over here work shy, getting on benefits. Well, they couldn't have been doing both. They would, but instead of the politicians who are really well educated and really well connected people, instead of them going, oh, wait a sec, say a statistic. I'm making these numbers up for the sake of this argument. But if a statistic comes up and it says that 40% of the British population believe that British jobs are being affected because of our immigration policies or whatever, if then that's not true, because like one particular fact is we had the lowest unemployment like ever at the time when we had the highest immigration. So clearly that's not true. But instead of the politicians going, no, I'll just stop you there, that's actually not true, this is true, what the politicians do is they go, what do the opinions polls say? And the opinions polls, they say people are not happy about the current immigration policy. Right, we're going to get tough on immigration. Rather than go, well, wait a minute. They know, the politicians know the truth that these perceptions I believe that to vote you should have to take a perception test to make sure that your perceptions are actually are true, because without that the people will have these perceptions and it will drive the opinion polls, and that drives policy, and the politicians know damn well that this is wrong, but they say they're going to do something about something which is a phantom. It's not even a real fear. It's a phantom menace. And the politicians keep saying we're going to solve all that, instead of going, actually, you know what? That's not even a problem. That I think would do a lot more to sort things out.
This is part of the issue that's out there is, and I saw this just before we started this conversation, so I don't have the exact figures, but Tortoise, which is a media organization, posted something on their Instagram story where they talked about how less than 30% of individuals in the UK trust the media in general, quote, in general, and something in the 30%, only something in the 30% trust the sources that they go to for their news regularly, go to their sources on a daily basis. So when you've got a situation like that, where people, for example, I find it's really absurd that the number's so low, because someone's going, okay, I'm going to go to the BBC every day for my news and not trust it. That's what people are saying out there. But when you've got a society like that, the problem for politicians is, how do they communicate? Either social media, where you're combating misinformation or people who are in their little burrows and don't want to come out and hear what you have to say, or you go on the news, where people have been through various misinformation and disinformation that's been spread and discord that's been sowed, don't trust the sources that they're hearing that comment through. They don't like the fact that the media, for example, might have clipped a short segment of someone's comment and not put it in the wider context, for example. And you get issues. So it's so hard to fight back. And this is why you need these companies. They're so powerful and they have this ability. And it's something that I'm really passionate about as someone who, is in that group that uses social media on a regular basis, even though sort of the data privacy thing, I think, concerns a lot of people. You end up using it because it's how people communicate these days. And you need those companies to step up and say, actually, we're going to do what's right. I don't think governments berating them or bullying them or regulating them into doing it is necessarily going to achieve that. What you need to do is...
Well, they're having a job taxing them, so...
Well, the problem is, the thing is, governments try to tax them to get them to, step up their game. And what do? They just moved all of their companies to low tax havens. Yeah. So you need to have a situation where the companies actually listen to their audience, they work, and they say, we're actually going to take that step without being forced to. We know this is right. I'm sure that while he probably likes making a lot of money and having a really successful company, Mark Zuckerberg doesn't want to be responsible for spreading misinformation and disinformation. He wants to have a site that actually achieves the aims that it was set up to do. Google probably wants to achieve something similar and doesn't want its companies and subsidiaries to be perpetuating falsehoods and spreading them. And they can do that. What they have to do is say, we're going to set the example here. We're so powerful. We can do that. We can shape the conversation. We can actually do it for the better. And it doesn't have to be where you're censoring or eliminating voices. It has to be a situation where you're going, actually, this is the best way to conduct a conversation. I regularly have conversations about, the conduct of people on Twitter. And I was having one the other day, and explaining the fact that, unfortunately, Twitter is not a place where reasonable debate can currently exist. It's impossible.
I think for me, I mean, I love Twitter. And for me, if you look at what, I don't know if they do now, but when Twitter first started to get popular, I looked into it before I got on there, and it did not describe itself as social media. It described itself, and this was because Facebook, I'm not even bothered with. But the reason why I went to Twitter was for this one reason. It didn't say it was social media, because I didn't want social media. I would rather have anti-social media. I would rather have get out of my Facebook. I want to have a load of people who don't have anything to do with me. But the reason why I was interested in Twitter was because when it originally, and I don't know about now, when it originally came out, it did not say it was social media. It said it was a micro-blogging site. And I thought, yeah, I want to get involved in that. Short blogs, brilliant. But I think it's become something else. And I think if only the people that were on there that are a pain in the neck realized it's a micro-blogging site. People write stuff as micro-blogs. Stop getting into all these bloody backwards and forwards and stuff. Get that on Facebook.
That's exactly the sort of situation that's emerged on these sites, is they've all morphed into something that they never intended to be.
Right.
As Facebook was so people could just, message each other and have a conversation and keep in touch with old school friends, or flirt with that person in class that you fancied, or whatever. That was what it was set up to. Twitter was so people could just share their either innate thoughts, or just to say, oh, the weather's lovely today, because they just wanted to say that to the world. Or they could, share what was actually happening at that moment, an event that was going on as it was happening, and document it, or follow along with an event live or whatever. People were able to do that. And those goals are fantastic. Those are great tools in society, and they have a huge place in society. But that's not what those sites have become now. If you go on Twitter and tweet something out, almost certainly someone will pop up to tell you how much they dislike what you said, and probably you personally, and they might then pop into your direct messages and reiterate how much they dislike you. And
if you want to get lots of tweets, here's two things you can tweet. Have a go at the NHS, or say that privatised railways are better than British Rail. Or cyclists. I'll give you a third one, cyclists. You go with any of those three, you're in for a whole world of fun.
and this is it. People will show up, though, to have a go at you. Often to have a go. Also, this is the other thing, is it becomes sort of a pile-on. People who have, so many times, there was a really interesting TED Talk about this, that some woman, this was years ago, made what was a poor taste joke. But a poor taste joke, it was meant to be a joke. And in a way, it was supposed to be a joke about the people who would think that's an okay joke to be.
Right, okay.
And they made it, and then they got on a plane for the next 12 hours to go abroad, as they were planning to do. And by the time that they landed, they had been fired from their job. They were the #1 trending thing on Twitter. They didn't know they'd been fired either. Twitter found out first, because people started tweeting. They found where they worked and started tweeting their company and saying why they should be fired. And their company responded that this person has now been fired. And this person obviously didn't know any of this. They were on a plane. Yeah. And when they got to the airport, there was journalists waiting because people worked out what plane they were on. And there was journalists waiting at the airport at the moment they arrived to ask them about all of this stuff that they had no knowledge of. And it was because a pile-on happened, because people who didn't know them and their sense of humor and what they were aiming to and the nuances that are all important just saw this and thought, this is a terrible joke, we're going to have an attack. And that's such a flaw in the system.
I hope you're right. I hope they can step up and sort it out. But I hope
Look,
I hope you can do it. I hope you're right, and it will go that way. Yeah,
certainly in the time that we live in, we've just got to be optimists these days, and optimism is what keeps us all going through and moving forward. So I think that's what we have to do, and that's the focus that we have to try. And hopefully, as I say, they are true to their original purpose. And I think if they are, then the world would be a much better and happier place.
Edward, it's been great talking to you. Unfortunately, we're out of time. I could talk to you all night. But the podcast is called The Hardy Report. You deal with all kinds of things to do with American politics in general, but skewed towards American politics. Yeah, you've got some podcasts that inspire you?
Yes, well, I'm a really big fan of Reply All. I love listening to Reply All, which is, it tells these stories and goes into these really interesting stories that people should check out. Also, can't say I'm not inspired by what people do on Pod Save America and the work that they've done, and Love It or Leave It over there, which I think is fantastic. And also, as I mentioned earlier, Tortoise, who do a little sort of 7-minute podcast stories that they do on news topics with people at the center of them. So I think those are really fascinating. And, I think that podcasts that tell stories that give people some more knowledge on what was going on is always a fantastic medium. And say that's what I try to do.
That's what your podcast definitely does. It does. You get the people on who really know, and you know enough about it to have a decent conversation with them. And yeah, it really is. It's the Hardy Report. It's available wherever you get your podcasts. And what's next for Edward Hardy?
Well, we're actually when this goes out, we'll be on a brief pause actually for the podcast. We're refreshing into a new season, so that's going to be really exciting. I can't wait to share it with people as to what it's going to sort of take the approach of looking into and the people we're going to have on the show. So it's going to be a fantastic new sort of setup, particularly now we're in a new era of politics and American politics. So that's going to be a great thing that I can't wait to share with people. And I say, if you go to, I think it's podfollow.com/The Hardy Reports. If you do that on your phone or whatever device, it will take you to the podcast app that is most appropriate for that platform. So podfollow.com/The Hardy Report. And people can find me at Edward T. Hardy on Twitter as well. And I do like to have a conversation with people. So if they want to have a civil discussion about things, please go and find me. Please go and talk to me on there. I'm always happy to do that.
Edward, great to talk to you. Thanks for your time.
Thank you for having me.